So this is a little, I mean, it's been a little bit. So I had my Bill Fichtner Bull in the Basement, which I've gotten a lot of commentary on, but I haven't done a Bull in the Basement in like a week and a half. I don't know what am I doing? Like, there's nothing that I'm doing that's more important than this. I don't think. Well, I mean, it doesn't matter. But it's time for a new version of Bull in the Basement. We're excited to have Tim O'Shea from the Buffalo News on, who has really been, ear to the grindstone for, is that the phrase, by the way? You're a journalist, is that right?
Ear to the grind. Is it nose?
Nose
I think
to the
it might be
grindstone.
nose. I think
Whatever.
it might be nose.
I'm a couple inches
I
away.
could be, who knows? I could be wrong.
I'm 3 inches away. Whatever. You're the journalist here. That's why maybe I just pitched you that to see how smart you were. Maybe I knew that and just was trying to throw you off your game a little bit. Anyway, you've had your nose to the grindstone. You've had your ear to the
ground.
Very good.
Ground.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay. There we go. All right. In terms of the Bill Stadium issue, and obviously it's a huge talking point. And you know what's funny? It's sort of lost some steam because of the bye week, because of the last 2 weeks of Bills football, which hasn't been particularly good. So the team itself has sort of taken over the public eye and the conversation, social media and beyond, about the team. But let's be honest, there is, without question, a timeline. There has been, for it seems like a couple of years, the discussion about a new stadium, and everybody there are people certainly taking sides, downtown or Orchard Park. The Bills, seemingly, Tim, want Orchard Park, but I will get into this whole discussion in a second. Thank you for doing this, clearly.
Very happy to be here. Yeah, I appreciate you asking me on.
Sure.
There's so much to talk about on this topic.
Yeah.
It'll be good. It's cool to be able to dig into it in some detail.
Yeah. You're a native of Buffalo, Western New York.
Mm-hmm.
Went to, you're a Bonnie, right?
I'm a St. Bonaventure grad, 1998. So yeah, you must know a lot of St. Bonaventure grads.
I do.
Been here long enough to know we're out there.
and I got to tell you, man, and RIP and prayers. I understand the owner of the Burton passed this past week, if I'm not mistaken. Was that right?
I heard, I didn't know. So I have to admit, no, I didn't know that. This may be an irrelevant point, but for anybody from Bonaventure out there, it's relevant. It's also going to out me a little. I was only at the Burton once in 4 years at Bonaventure. And I'm sad to hear, I know the owner, I never met him. I know both him and that place are legendary. I was always up. I started covering the Bills when I was in college. So I was always up here in Buffalo, very rarely in Olean outside of classes. So it doesn't make me a very good Bonnie. But no, I'm sorry. I'm sorry to hear he passed, if that happened this last week. Yeah.
I say that only because I've been to, Friday night, Saturday game at Riley Center, Saturday night in Olean, and I've had some really good times in Olean over the years. So
you had more than I have then. You can tell me about it.
But to your benefit, if you hadn't done what you did, and God bless you, I'll tell you what, there's probably a lot of people that would have given their right arm to be in the position you were in school to cover the Bills at that point, right? I mean, now granted, the Bills weren't good, or they were around, they were okay when you first got into it, right?
Yeah. So it's funny. My high school years, grades, all 4 grades, 9 through 12, the Bills went to the Super Bowl. I graduated high school on the night of the O.J. Simpson car chase, white Bronco chase.
Right.
That was my high school graduation night. The next day, my neighbor, a guy named Jack Connors, who was the longtime publisher of Business First newspaper here in Buffalo, came to me and he said, and I'd been a writer at that point. I was writing for Baseball Digest and doing some pretty cool work at the time. I was really grateful to be doing. Jack came up and he offered me what really was like a dream job for a kid who had just watched the Bills go to the Super Bowl 4 years in a row. He said, "We're starting a Buffalo Bills magazine." It was called Bills Insider, the official team magazine. And he said, "I'd like you to come freelance for Business First and write for our Bills publication." So I graduated Frontier High School, got a job covering the Buffalo Bills freelance, and then went off to St. Bonaventure. And I had a 93 green Ford Tempo that I just kept driving back and forth for the next 3 or 4 years. covering the Bills every, Wednesday, Thursday, Sunday. And it was great. I loved doing it. I did catch him at the tail end of the Levy Kelly Hall of Famer years. So that was a really great time to get into this. And then, since then I've moved over more to the business side and still really happy to be doing it.
Yeah. I had no idea you wrote for Baseball Digest. That is so cool because I'm much older than you. And I remember as a kid, Baseball Digest was this almost book size, not magazine size magazine. And so when I was a little kid, my friends used to nickname me Football Digest because I knew like every player, what college you went to, every number, every position for every team in the NFL. That's probably why I didn't have girlfriends for a very long time and didn't get married till I was 40. That's all aside. But that's so cool that you work for Baseball Digest. That's awesome. And what a great legendary sports publication for sure.
Oh, and it was a great place to break in. It was that and locally the Hamburg Sun. It was those two publications. And what happened, and it's a story that I tell aspiring journalists and just, teens and kids a lot, is I got cut from my high school baseball team in 11th grade, thus ending my dream of becoming a Major League Baseball player. And I had this like little conversation with myself. I mean, just in my head, I don't want to give up on the dream of making the big leagues, but obviously I'm not good enough. What could I do? What am I good at? And I'd always been not always, but I mean, in high school, I developed into a decent writer and I liked meeting people. And I thought, what the heck? Let's try this. And I sent a letter. This was just barely pre-email, like it was at the very end of snail mail being the primary form of reaching out to people you don't know. I sent a letter to the editor of Baseball Digest, pitched him a story on a baseball scout from Buffalo named Cy Williams. And he wrote me back, or he called me, actually. He called me. My little sister answered the phone, handed it to me. I pretended like I was a lot older. And he said, listen, I like your story idea. Write it on spec. If it's good, I'll pay you $150 and we'll publish it. And that's what started it all.
That is awesome. Okay. And this is, if you haven't watched Bull in the Basement, I am all over the place. I think I have undiagnosed ADHD. I'm pretty sure. Because I am so scatterbrained when I come to this thing. So bear with me. Hearing all of that, before we get into the primary reason for having you on was because you have studied the stadium issue inside out. And that's going to be the primary focus of this interview. But for you, is there a standout interview that you've done that either was sort of like somebody that would be bucket listed for you, that you're just mind blown that you got this assignment, like, oh my God, I cannot believe I'm doing a sit down with so-and-so? If that's the case, who would that be?
Can I give you two?
Sure.
May I give you two? Okay,
yeah.
Cool. Ironically, I think it's funny because people ask a version of that question a lot, and it's changed for me over the years. But I'll give you two, one early, one recent, and there's a similarity between both. For Football Digest, which, as obviously was not only you in high school, but also, an actual publication, a sister pub of Baseball Digest. Once I started writing for Football Digest, I pitched them a story on an old Michigan football player who had turned down 2 NFL contracts because he wanted to go to law school. And this all had happened in the 1930s. But I thought it would be a really cool story because that guy was Gerald Ford, who then, of course, went on to become a congressman, vice president, and then president of the United States. And so we're talking like maybe 1999, 2000, right at the end of President Ford's life, or near the end. I pitched that story to Football Digest, and I said, if I could get a hold of Gerald Ford to talk about his days playing football, would you go for it? And the answer came back, well, hell yeah, do it. So I reached out, and through his chief of staff and President Ford loved talking about football. Far more. I'd interviewed him later on about politics. He was cool with it. He didn't love it, but he absolutely loved talking about his old football playing days, what he had learned from football, about teamwork, about handling racial issues, about handling, because I was big, even with his team, about handling tough decisions like, do I go play in the NFL or do I go to law school? He thought law school would lead to something bigger and more lasting. He became president. It worked out just fine for him. So that was a big one. Much more recently, this is at the Buffalo News in the last couple of years. For a while, I was spending quite a bit of time talking on an almost weekly basis to a guy from Grand Island who originally came here from Eastern Africa and then moved back to his home country of Somalia and became president. And then and he's still president now. His name is President Mohammed. His first name and last name are the same. So Mohammed Abdullahi Mohammed. And he's got an incredibly difficult job leading Somalia, which is one of the countries I would say that if you think of the various ways a country could struggle: poverty, terrorism, famine, economic issues, international issues. He is dealing with every one of those things and more. And who would have thought, but in this job in the Buffalo News, I was taking weekly WhatsApp calls from the president of Somalia for months, which has resulted in a couple of really interesting stories. That was never on my bucket list because I never would have thought to put it on there.
Right.
But I have to tell you, I mean, it's been this fascinating ride as a journalist, and I know you know this as a broadcast personality, as a host. The people you meet, the situations you find yourself in, the conversations above all that you find yourself in are mind-blowingly fascinating, and I've always been so grateful for that.
Yeah, blessed for sure. I would agree. Same for me. Tim O'Shea, Buffalo News, joining us in this edition of Bull in the Basement. So, all right, let's fast forward. Let's get to the football stuff. Let's talk
stadium. All right, let's do it.
So the Pegulas seemingly are in favor of an Orchard Park place. Obviously, the talk is ECC basically gets raised, ECC South, and that's where a new stadium would go.
Yeah, pretty close. If I'll offer one teeny bit of clarity there.
Yeah.
Jason Wolf, who's our sports enterprise reporter, Jason Wolf and I, along with Tom Precious in Albany, Steve Watson here in Buffalo, Sandy Tan here in Buffalo, and more of our colleagues have all been working on this story. And Jason and I have done multiple pieces lately. We were down at the owners' meetings. We have a long list of points we want to clarify. Here's one. So the Bills want to put the stadium across the street, Abbott Road, for those who are familiar, across the street in suburban Orchard Park from the current stadium, from Highmark Stadium. So the land, one of the reasons that they prefer that spot is that the land is shovel ready and it's county-owned land that's adjacent to Erie Community College land. And so we clarified this the other day. They want county land. They may need a little bit of ECC land depending how the planning works out. And then, ECC, and I don't know too much about this, so I don't want to say too much or suggest too much. But ECC South has been recommended for closure or potential closure. That doesn't mean it is closing. That's not the case right now, to my knowledge. But it's on. It could potentially close, which I guess then would potentially open up that land. And you hear me saying, I guess, and potentially, because it's one of many things in this storyline that's yet to be determined. But yeah, basically it would go across the street in an area that right now we know to be a parking lot that kind of juts up against DCC.
And maybe this is way too early in the discussion, but what then would happen to the current stadium, or are we not even there yet?
They knock it down. What would happen is they build a new stadium and then knock down the old stadium. They'd raise it and it becomes a parking lot.
Okay.
And interestingly, this is something we get asked a lot too.
Yeah, we're flip-flopping the landscape basically.
Yeah, basically, okay. Yeah. You in the training center would stay up.
Okay.
The Pegulas would put something like, this is not exact, but something like 140, 150, 160 million, somewhere in there, into that training center, at Pro Training Center. So they want to keep that. And so that would all stay. The current stadium would ultimately become a parking lot. And that $1.4 billion that the Bills have projected an OP stadium would cost also includes the cost of knocking down Highmark Stadium.
Got it. Okay. So, I mean, listen, if you're going to compare other stadiums that are new in the last, let's say, 3 to 5 years in the NFL, And part of that 1.4 billion is destruction of Highmark. And I have no idea. I don't know anything about tearing down buildings. I don't know what it costs. But now you're talking potentially under $1 billion, potentially, to build a brand new stadium, which is, let's be honest, much less than what some of those other stadiums, some of those other cities have paid. Talking places like Minnesota, Atlanta, right?
Right. Los Angeles,
Yeah.
SoFi Stadium is the biggest
Vegas, yeah.
example. Yeah, Vegas, yeah, Allegiant in Vegas and SoFi in Los Angeles are the two newest. So the Bills Stadium, and to your point, let me back up. To your point, I'm not sure either exactly what it would cost to raise Highmark, but yeah, you're talking. I'm projecting here. These are all projections right now. You're still talking $1 billion or a little bit more to build that new stadium. A good reference point for this whole thing, Rich, is years ago the Pegulas paid $1.4 billion to buy the Buffalo Bills. Coincidentally, that's also what it roughly will cost to build a new Orchard Park stadium. And that is a lot less than what you see happen in some other places. Not too many stadiums have been built in the NFL in recent years, though, too. There have been some pretty big renovations. There's been Las Vegas and Los Angeles, which are huge, especially Los Angeles, which is like a city. SoFi Stadium, I should say, is like a city within itself outside of the city of Los Angeles. So really, the Buffalo Bills, no matter where they end up putting a stadium, whether it's in Orchard Park as they want, whether somehow it ends up downtown, we could talk about what that could look like, how that might happen if it were to happen. But no matter what they do, they're actually setting a bit of a precedent here in the NFL, because the other places where you've seen stadiums get built are really big cities: Vegas, LA, Atlanta, places like that. The smaller market teams in the NFL, Cincinnati is not that small, but it's on the smaller side. It's still a lot bigger than Buffalo. Green Bay, Lambeau Field was renovated, but Kansas City renovated. None of these smaller cities have built a stadium in recent years. So what the Bills do here is really going to set a model for Cincinnati, which is going to be looking at potentially building a new stadium a few years out. And some other cities to come too. So that's a big reason the NFL owners are watching this. They'd be watching anyway, but they can watch it with there's a little extra reason to pay close attention to what happens here.
Okay, so you hear from Bills brass that Orchard Park, the reason for it, I'm assuming, is for affordability, number one, both from the taxpayer and from them. Fair, right? Also,
presumably,
also, I would assume because, just tradition is probably another reason that's kind of thrown in there and mentioned. I know they mentioned the fan base and tailgating, which for me, I think is a ploy to get their fans behind them for what they want to do. I mean, I don't, we've heard the Bills in not very recent times say, hey, we're not really big fans of some of the things that happen at tailgates. So I don't know how big of a fan they are of tailgates or how much they're playing to the fan base, which is fine. I get it. It's not unintelligent to do that. But these are some of the reasons, but more in depth, like the real solid reasons as to why they want Orchard Park versus downtown.
Well, you hit the biggest ones. And, if you had somebody from the Bills on, and by the way, there are not too many people from the Bills or Pegula Sports who can speak to this in a lot of detail. They've kept the circle very, very, very surprisingly, I think, to people on the outside, very tight. So you really would need Ron Raccuia, who's their executive vice president, Kimmer-Terry Pegula, a few others to speak to this. But if you were, my strong suspicion or my knowledge based on having these conversations is, they would tell you that fans overwhelmingly want Orchard Park for the reasons you just said, Rich, that they like the tailgating, they like the accessibility, they like the space. There's traffic going out to Orchard Park, but it doesn't get, in NFL terms, it doesn't get that snarled. And people are accustomed to it too, let's face it. I mean, what Bills traffic is going to be. Here's a little bit of my opinion thrown in. People in Buffalo in general are a little more averse to change than you will see in some other cities. That said, and this is a huge caveat to what I just said, anecdotally, I hear from a lot of people who would love to see a stadium downtown, and I mean a lot. And that's just me chatting with people, hearing from people. So as much as I can say, people in Buffalo like tradition and they like things to be a better version of what they've been. This is one where I do wonder if people could get behind a downtown stadium were it to happen. We'll see. Affordability, though, back to your point, that's a huge one. 1.4 billion for an NFL stadium actually isn't that high. Not for an NFL stadium. It's a load of money, but for what they're talking about building, it's actually not. It's not an elaborate expenditure. It's pretty on target to the extent of my knowledge for what's something of that size and scope and durability. It's got to last for decades. It's pretty on target for what that should cost.
Do you suspect, and I don't know how we would even be able to judge this, but do you suspect that this brand new stadium will be as luxurious as it could or would be? Do you suspect that there might be some cutting corners, that it might not necessarily be all the bells and whistles that some people may have seen, to your point, in LA or in Vegas or in some of the Atlantas or the Minneapolises, where these stadiums in the last 5 years have been popping up? You might not see the extravagance, but people in Buffalo might not care at the same time.
Yeah, and to all your points, I don't know that people in Buffalo would necessarily know the difference unless they're traveling around to other cities. And if they are, and which is fine, and if you are traveling around to other cities, then the question becomes this: if you go to a Buffalo Bills game, are you going because the stadium is just so cool and just so fancy? Or are you going to stand out in hopefully a blizzard in December when the Bills are playing the Dolphins, and maybe rip your shirt off to reveal like that red and blue hairy chest? Sorry, that's disgusting, but it's real, right? This happens.
Yeah.
That's a lot of reason people go to Bills games. They're not looking for fancy, right?
Yeah,
It's also a lot of reason why, you hear a surprising, to me at least, number of people until recently who were saying, let's just, I like Highmark. Like, let's fix up Highmark. We can get into that too, if you want. So yeah, it's not going to resemble what you would see in Los Angeles. It's not going to resemble what you would see in Vegas, but those are major tourism cities. They are serving a crowd that does love football, but they also love going to places where you're there to be seen and to see other people.
That's right. It's
a little bit different. I think that's dramatically different than Buffalo. Now, an interesting point too that'll be hard to get at, but I think there's something to it. Is there have been stadium brainstorms and plans and studies around Buffalo for a while. They've been talking about building a new stadium. Even the state almost offered it up in the last negotiation 10 years ago. This has been talked about for a while. It would be interesting to take a look at pre-pandemic and post-pandemic ideal Buffalo stadium plans and see what kind of things remain and what kind of things get cut. I would think some of the bells and whistles, the cosmetic elaborate type of things. I don't have a real, I won't make up an example because I don't have a real one. There might be some things that make a stadium look a little more grandiose that you don't see now, maybe. I do think what you're gonna see, and this is big and it fits what Buffalo wants, is you're gonna see more things like party decks. You're gonna see more communal spaces where people can stand and gather and watch the game, but also hang at a bar where they can gather in groups of friends, where not everybody who's in that stadium is necessarily sitting in a seat or even has a seat assigned to them. And that's a trend, as you know, I'm sure, straight across sports. I was at Yankee Stadium on Labor Day, and they have expensive party decks. They have $15 party decks. The place has a lot of great seats and it has a lot of party decks. And I mean, that's the New York Yankees. That's the most iconic sports franchise in the world, and they're doing it. You'll see that here in Buffalo too.
That's interesting. Talking about money, let's talk before we get to the downtown idea. And if is there any more on Orchard Park that we need to discuss more in depth that people need to know that maybe they didn't, in terms of why it's there and what it's going to be, if it comes to this?
Well, something I think people should watch for and ask about, and the asking about starts with us, right? With the journalists at the News and Beyond who are covering it, is if you put a stadium in Orchard Park, what more can you do with it? Like, what can you do to create more of a community, to create spin-off economic development? A guy who's been a great source of mine and who's a good friend of yours, John Simperman. I want to give a shout out to John on this because he spoke to Jason Wolf and I in some detail about this. John, for people who don't immediately register his name, John Simperman is a longtime sports executive in the NHL, the NBA, a longtime sports marketing agency owner who's done a lot of stadium development work. And so he's one of the foremost experts in the country on how a stadium can be integrated into a community. You would have to do that if you put it downtown, which I suspect is a conversation we're about to have.
Yep.
But you could do that if you're doing it in Orchard Park as well, whether it's restaurants, hotels, offices. I'm not sure what that looks like nowadays, but offices, housing. This is me spitballing and it's me throwing out big concepts. That's easy to do. It's much harder to put that into action, but it really is something that should be discussed, especially if ECC South closes, because you're going to have a lot of space there.
Yep.
And it doesn't all need to be for parking.
Well,
So
I mean, like you, having covered the Bills for a very long time and being on the road with them for a bunch of years, you know, the one thing that comes to mind right out of the gate is Foxborough. I mean, Gillette Stadium is literally in the middle of nowhere, kind of similar to what Highmark is. And they have built a city around that stadium. There's hotels, to your point, hotels, restaurants, retail, everything right there, where you could literally go and stay at the stadium for a weekend if you were at tickets to a game. And looking at that landmass that is on the other side of Abbott from the current stadium, I could totally see something like that happening.
Right. In Green Bay, Wisconsin is another example too, Titletown with the Green Bay Packers. So yeah, that is something that I imagine. I don't want to say we're going to see it in Orchard Park. That would be me over projecting. I don't know that. But it's going to be talked about. I think it's going to be demanded. And, you know, as a longtime business journalist as well, and just observing and writing about these things, it really should happen. There's a great opportunity to integrate that space into the surrounding community. And, you know, for any of us, I grew up in the South Towns. For any of us who have grown up or lived south of Buffalo, you know, there's a lot of opportunity there, a lot of space in places, and that's one of them, and a lot of opportunity to draw more people in and to build it out more. The Buffalo Bills could be one of the best ways of doing that in a grand way.
So I'm going to interrupt the conversation between OP and downtown for a second, because this is important and it affects both, obviously. I think another big question, I mean, people obviously want to know where the stadium is going to be, what it's going to look like, what kind of amenities it's going to have, but they also want to know, you know, how's it going to affect my wallet, you know, in terms of being a taxpayer. I think and I've had this discussion with a boatload of people in the last couple of weeks about this. And I get the feeling that people think, because they say, well, we're paying for all of it, right? And I get the feeling that people think that only people in Buffalo and Western New York are going to pay for the stadium in terms of taxpayer money. And that's completely untrue, right? I mean, it's a New York state. And I tell them this, how many times as Buffalonians have we bitched and moaned about, oh, we're just sending our money downstate. It's just going to build a new Yankee Stadium. It's going to go build the new Brooklyn Nets arena. It's going to build the new Long Island, New York Islanders arena. And we never get it back here. Here's the opportunity to bring it back here. Now, again, the question to you, how ultimately would it affect the Western New York taxpayer?
My suspicion is, well, let me step back and offer another caveat. I think it's important for journalists and, you know, anybody who's speaking publicly to acknowledge like where you have expertise, where you have deep knowledge, and where you have enough knowledge to answer the question, but not position yourself as an expert. That last point, that's me on this one. Here's what I know. First of all, the New York State budget is around $200 billion, a little bit more. So we're talking 1/200th of that cost. Let's say the state throws in $1 billion just to keep the numbers round-ish.
Sure. Yeah.
So we're talking 1/200th approximately, maybe a little less than that, of the state budget in a single year. this is not a single year expense. It's an expense that, and this is now where I'm going to go into areas I don't 100% understand, right?
Math is not your expertise.
No, I mean, well, yeah, the basic math is, but this is why you have investment bankers
Right.
and financial consultants, and this we're about to get in the. If you get down to the dollar amounts, this gets pretty high level. But basically, you don't, much like you don't, unless you have, unless you're buying a $250,000 house and you've got $250,000 in a bank account, you're not paying for that house all at once. You're getting a mortgage and you're paying over 15 or 30 years. Essentially, you're not going to hear the word mortgage used on a stadium. Essentially, if you're bonding and other financial tools, the same thing happens. So if the state puts in $1 billion of taxpayer or public money, that's going to be spread out over the course of years, of decades, not of any one single year. If it was one single year, it's less than 1/200th of the state budget. It's not one single year, which means that we're talking even less per year of that. So that's one, for perspective, that's one thing. So my bottom line suspicion is people wouldn't notice the difference in their taxes based on that. That's one. Two is a lot of school districts, including, I believe, Buffalo, and I'll throw this out there and say we would need to double check me on this, but I believe Buffalo is one of them. And I shouldn't say a lot, but a handful of big city school districts get aid from the state each year that's in the range of $1 billion, or perhaps if it's New York City, much more, right? So we'd have to double check my numbers on that, but there are other things and places that get $1 billion. Now, one of the counter arguments that jumps in, and this is a really good point, is Terry Pegula and Kim Pegula are billionaires. Why are we helping them build a stadium? That's a question that I ask too, and we've dug into it. We're going to dig into it a lot more. I can tell you one of the responses will be, and it's not a response that's going to satisfy people, but it's absolutely 100% true. If you don't, and they choose to move somewhere else, somebody else will build it. That's one answer. Another answer you would hear from the Bills on that is, if we put we bought the Bills for $1.4 billion because over time, if we keep the team, that team goes up in value. It already has, right? So $1.4 billion for the Bills is a good investment. For a stadium, which is a necessity to keeping that team, it's harder in a place like Buffalo, where you can't charge astronomical dollars for personal seat licenses, for suites, for premium tickets, even for advertising sponsorships. You can't charge what Los Angeles, Atlanta, Las Vegas, Chicago, and so on can charge. You just can't do it. You can't charge what the Jets and the Giants can make down in across the river in New Jersey. So that's one of the reasons why, on the Bills side, why they would say we need public help. We could go on, we can dig in deeper and deeper. I want to make clear too, I don't have a side or an opinion on this. I'm giving what both sides are. And
sure.
That's when you dig into it, that's what you hear.
Yeah. Is it a good thing for Western New York that we just happen to have, politics aside, a Western New Yorker in the governor's office, at least right now? I mean, in terms of timeline and when and if this is going to happen, is it advantageous to us to have Kathy Hochul being a Western New Yorker in office in Albany?
If your point of view is, I am from Buffalo and I want the Buffalo Bills to remain in Western New York, then Kathy Hochul becoming governor was one of the best things that could have happened. My strong suspicion is Andrew Cuomo wasn't going to let the Buffalo Bills go anywhere had he remained governor. And I don't think any governor of New York State would want to not only want to see that happen, but allow that to happen. But in terms of keeping the negotiations moving, or even getting them moving, and in terms of understanding what the Buffalo Bills mean to Western New York beyond the dollars, and we can get into financial impact too, if you like, because it's really hard to measure it in dollar amounts and hard dollars. But if you want somebody who really appreciates it and has lived it, Kathy Hochul grew up in Buffalo. She lived for a long time in Hamburg, 10 minutes from where the Buffalo Bills play football. Close enough, honestly, where if things got really loud, you could probably hear the noise from Highmark Stadium over at her house, or at least quite close to that. So she really does get that. The interesting thing to me is, by all accounts, the stadium negotiations up through August of this past summer, so just a couple of months ago, 3 months ago, were very, very, very silent. In other words, they weren't really happening. There was just not a lot going on. Kathy Hochul became governor, and soon enough, the stadium negotiations started happening. And now they're talking at least once a week, maybe more. In fact, I would assume probably more. So that's not just Kathy Hochul's doing, but I can tell you the state was quiet under Cuomo and the state's engaged under Hochul. So yeah, it's good for Buffalo that she's there if your goal is to keep the Bills.
Yeah.
If your goal is not to spend any public money for a stadium, I think that would have happened under any governor, most likely. But yeah, Kathy Hochul is going to be pretty. In fact, she told us she's willing. She wants it in the budget. So we learned that directly from her a couple of weeks ago.
Which may, as she comes up for re-election, if you will, next year, may hurt her downstate potentially, right? I mean,
she'll have to explain it. She'll have to defend it. Yeah. I mean, and that's pure, Rich. I mean, obviously that's pure politics.
Sure.
She will, the political calculus for her is really, really interesting here. And I say this just from the outside watching, and easy for me to call it interesting. It's actually, incredibly complicated. But it basically comes down to this. The one part of the state that Kathy Hochul can absolutely count on winning would be Western New York, right? The one way to guarantee you don't win it is lose the Buffalo Bills. Nobody, by the way, I want to pause on that. Absolutely nobody's talking about the Bills moving out of Buffalo in any serious way. Anything you hear about that beyond just acknowledging that it's a distant possibility is people overblowing it. Like there's no reason right now to think the Bills are going anywhere. Absolutely not. That said, if the negotiations weren't going anywhere at all, then you would start hearing talk or chatter of that, kicking up. None of that would be good for Kathy Hochul, right? So she's got a tough primary coming up in June. She's going to be facing Letitia James, the state attorney general. It sounds very likely Bill de Blasio, the outgoing New York City mayor. I'm sure some other Democrats, and then whoever's going to end up on the Republican side will be waiting right after that if she even wins in the primary. So she's got some tough months coming up very, very soon. The best thing she could do politically, and for the timeline of building a new stadium, by the way, as well, would be lock this down soon. It's not my job to consult for the governor, but if I were speculating on what a political consultant and economic development people would consider to be a good move, wherever you put the stadium, also make sure that there's a real plan for the ancillary development you and I were talking about a few minutes ago. How is this going to be good for the community, not just for the Bills, not just for the Pegulas, the owners? How's it going to help Western New York? What is it going to give us that we don't already have?
Yeah.
Right. So we don't just want a new stadium. We want a new stadium and something more.
Yeah.
So if you can sell that development and that money, and then explain to people as best you can how that $1 billion is being spent and where it's coming from, and that would help. And then the other thing too is Kathy Hochul, Governor Hochul, has to take care of downstate. And if anybody's been paying attention to her schedule, she is in New York City almost every day. I get her schedule every night on a media list, and it almost always says Governor Hochul is in New York City. She's home maybe once a week in Erie County, and then she's back to New York. So she's really not only figuratively, but literally living there right now.
You were at the NFL owners meetings. And so I bring up the governor for a lot of reasons, what we just talked about, but also because there is a very serious timeline going on here, largely in part because of the lease, right? I mean, the Pegulas have stated outright, listen, we do not, because it's just too expensive, want to do anything with the current stadium in terms of renovation whatsoever. And the lease, what is there, 18 months left in the lease, something like that? Maybe
there's essentially, July 23, it runs out. There's essentially one more season. It'll look like 2 more years on paper, but one more season left on the lease.
So that timeline's important, right?
Very, very important. So here's the situation with the stadium. Jason Wolf and I did a report on this one back in August. We took a tour of the stadium. we reviewed in detail a lengthy report commissioned by Erie County through an engineering firm to what was working and what's not working with Highmark Stadium. There are a number of issues. It's nearly 50 years old. Two of the biggest and most expensive ones are the upper deck is near the end of its lifespan. It's perfectly safe right now. And I really want to emphasize that there's no reason to think you're going to have any problem going to Highmark Stadium this year, next year, the year after that. This was a report that was looking out over, the next decade and beyond. In 5 to 7 years, there's going to be extensive repairs, nearly a rebuild needed of the upper deck of Highmark Stadium. Also, the lower ring bowl right around the field there, essentially because it's built at grade and the earth shifts. Who thought earth science would play into football conversation, but it does. So geologically, the earth moves, the stadium moves with it. And so that lower ring bowl has been separating out, and that would need to be replaced too. There's other wiring, water main issues. There's a lot going on there. So Highmark Stadium has a solid 5 to 7 years to go, and then it would require some pretty expensive work to be done beyond that. That puts a timeline on getting a new stadium. That's number one. In a state report that Governor Hochul just released, really dispense with any remaining notion that Highmark Stadium should be renovated or rebuilt. Highmark Stadium is about to be finished, right? That's solidly factually set, right? So that's number one. So you've got 5 to 7 years to go there. You've got a lease that runs out in 23, so one more year to go. And then you have here the political calendar we just talked about, where from whether you're Governor Hochul, state legislators, and even other, statewide officials and local officials who are in the federal government, Senator Chuck Schumer, Congressman Brian Higgins, some others, people who are going to be up for re-election, who aren't going to want an open-ended discussion about the Buffalo Bills happening while they're asking the voters for their support, right? So there's every reason to want to get this thing done soon on a political level, on a structural level, knowing that Highmark's going to need repairs, and just to get the Bills into a new stadium, because eventually there could be a year where in fact there will be, where a new stadium's being built and the Bills are playing in Highmark, and you want Highmark to be ready to go without putting massive money in it just to stick a Band-Aid on it for like 1 or 2 more seasons. Yeah. So it is pretty time sensitive, even though we're talking 2026 is the earliest a new stadium would open. It seems like forever, but it's not. It's actually really close in this, in this realm.
Okay, so we mentioned very, very early in the conversation about that there's the OP argument, there's the downtown argument, there's businesses in Buffalo that are aligning with the OP argument, there's businesses that are aligning with the downtown argument. We haven't got to the downtown argument yet. What is the argument for a downtown? So what's the pluses? I know one thing we ultimately hear is infrastructure, right? That's the one word we hear about a downtown stadium, that there's no infrastructure. Traffic would be terrible. It would be awful getting out of there. It's terrible getting out of a Sabres game. It would be just brutal. And that you see some of the designs, and there is rail, right? Running right alongside the stadium. If that is realistic or not, I don't know. But that certainly would pick up some of the traffic, clearly. And there are plenty of, my understanding, satellite lots within about the same walking distance as you would going to a Bills game in Orchard Park. So I know people are saying, well, there's no parking, there's no tailgating, there's no infrastructure, even though the 190 is right there. And so is Route 5. That seems to be the argument against, in addition to the price tag, right?
Right. So the arguments for, and there's going to be more and more of these coming out right now. So I'm gonna hit some, and there will certainly be, Rich, a lot of your listeners who say, but what about this? What about this? This is just a couple, knowing that there's a lot more. It's bring a lot more people downtown. It'll only do it, in a good year, 12 times or so. You get a few more concerts in, things like that. But hold
on, let me stop you, because at least the one rendering I saw, put a convention center there. Now I get it. I've been hearing
right. That was my next one. That's my next one. Yeah.
So it would get used more than 12 times, ideally. And maybe
if you put Yeah. That's where I was going with that. So like the stadium itself for football and concerts will only draw people roughly a dozen times or
And
so.
you could maybe put a Final Four in there at some point, things, whatever. But
Possibly.
you might get 20
Hockey would-
athletic
yeah.
events and concerts. Sure. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, for a lot of what we could brainstorm down that road for a while, and it would
Yeah.
eventually involve a dome or a retractable roof, which
That's
is
right.
really-
That's right.
But it's in the realm of possibility. So for the conversation like this, yeah, we should acknowledge it. There is a lot you could do that way. Yes, you could put a convention center in there. That would draw more people as long as they draw the conventions.
Right.
Now, the argument there would be we need a bigger, better convention center to draw those conventions. The next thing they'll need, though, is more hotels and more. And if you then start thinking about it, I'm getting into some of the drawbacks. I told you I'd give you the pro. I'm going to mix them up here, right? So continuing down the stream of conscious brainstorm here, you get a convention center in here and you go for those big conventions, or the biggest convention of all that combines football would be a Super Bowl, something like that. Even setting aside that you would need a dome, you also need not only enough hotel rooms, but a certain level of hotel. Buffalo doesn't necessarily have enough rooms or the level of hotel. And one of the ways that this is going back to something John Simperman, the sports marketing expert and longtime executive, mentioned. One of the ways that is we've never had an NHL All-Star game here.
That's right.
Not since that arena opened in the mid 90s.
Which is crazy.
Right? So now, and there's counter arguments. I'm speaking in very broad, simplistic terms here, and I want to acknowledge that. But that's part of what, that's part of what's going on here. So pros, though, you're going to get more people downtown. You can make an argument that the space that would be used, that much of it's not being used in a way that's like highly monetized right now anyway. So you could throw that argument in there as a reason to put it there. Now, some of the cons, the traffic, the infrastructure is one. You can address that. And my suspicion is there's probably ways to address parking as well. It adds a lot of time on. It would take more time and a lot more money, not only to build a downtown stadium, but to do the infrastructure work, the site reviews. Not all that land is shovel ready. In fact, most of it's probably not. In fact, I'm not even sure any of it is, to be honest. They would have to check that and talk about what land they're looking at. But essentially, it's going to cost a lot more money, to take a lot more time. And remember, Highmark Stadium only has so much time left. So that's a complication too. Doesn't mean you can't do it. It's just a lot more complicated. And we could go on. If you develop it downtown, you could not only look at a convention center, but a lot more spin-off development that could then connect back over with what's happening down at the waterfront, canal side, the arena, which is used quite a lot, right? I mean, unlike football stadiums, which sit empty most of the year, hockey and basketball style arenas are used and can be used much of the year. So downtown Buffalo has developed so incredibly much over the last 10, 15 years. You could make an argument that the stadium would build on top of that, help accelerate it, and maybe bring some of the things Buffalo doesn't have. And then I'm going to throw two other little details in there, but one I think is really significant on a human level. The tailgating, my suspicion is you can find a way around that, but it's not going to look the same downtown as it would in the suburbs. Okay, that's one thing. Bigger thing. There's people whose homes are going to be displaced. In fact, there's a lot of people whose homes are going to be displaced. And it shouldn't be lost in the conversation that when, I'm not sure what the numbers are, but when you're talking about relocating potentially several hundred families who are living in housing complexes there, that's not a small thing, even if people aren't talking about it. It's actually a big deal. And I'm not saying it's a reason not to look into it or, to look away from it. But on a very human level, you got to look at that too. And that's a real part of this. So I think any discussion of the stadium is incomplete without acknowledging.
Yeah. And listen, I mean, we throw around the phrase city of good neighbors, and we wouldn't be ones if we didn't take that into account. Right. And we wouldn't live up to that mantra. So, you gave some pros, you gave some cons. ideally for you, and obviously it's going to be significantly more expensive. The timeline's a lot different, takes a lot longer. Infrastructure's a problem, it's an issue. If you were a betting man, I mean, it sounds to me, even though I know we're getting pushed for both from significant people on both sides, it sounds to me though that OP is going to win in the end. I mean, if you're a betting man, would you bet OP is to be the place where it's going to end up?
Yeah, I want to make clear, I don't have any inside information on this. So this is just me answering your question.
Yeah.
Person to person, media guy to media guy.
Yeah. What's your gut?
My gut right now is Orchard Park with some kind of downtown development mixed into that in some way. And that's my gut. I couldn't connect those things here for you right now without completely spitballing it. And I don't want to go that far because then I'm just, then I'm just trying to like connect dots that I only suspect are there. I don't know where they're. My gut on that is based on the finances. I think I can envision a world in which the Pegulas are putting in, let's say, I don't know, $200 or $300 million, something like that. I don't know that to be true. It's just my gut. Where the state and the county are putting in around $1 billion or so, and where that's palatable to everybody, and where the elected officials involved feel like they can go out and sell it, so long as there's some ancillary, significant, noticeable ancillary development involved, and really sell the idea to people in Buffalo that, hey, you're going to have a crown jewel of a stadium. I think you can do the same thing downtown, but it's going to take longer. It's going to be way more expensive, of course. And there's almost guaranteed to be complications that come up in any kind of building. They're going to come up. But when you're building there's so many more that can come up.
Yeah.
And I don't know that the elected officials involved are quite going to have the stomach for that. But that's just my gut. I could also envision a world where they do a grandiose project downtown and sell it as the transformative project that wraps together all the amazing progress that's been happening in Buffalo over the last, slowly but surely, and sometimes fast, over the last couple of decades.
I mean, listen, pretty much all of Canalside, Pegulas are responsible for the most part, right? And why not throw football and now make it really Pegulaville, right? I mean, if you put a football stadium down there, I mean, I can see that thought process, even though it's probably not the most frugal one or the most sensible one, but I can see that going through people's brains, for sure.
Let me give you a little interesting, like, connect the dots over the years.
Yeah, sure.
If you look at Canalside, this is an aside about Canalside, but if you look at Canalside, the whole vision for that really started with, this is not a complete list, but Bob and Mindy Rich, along with Larry Quinn and some other people who were working on it back in the early 2000s. And then it was accelerated in a sense, indirectly, by Tom Golisano buying the Sabres and stabilizing that franchise, which kept them anchored in that arena, right? Because that's the Sabres are in real danger of leaving Buffalo.
Sure.
Back in the early 2000s. So Golisano bought them, kept them here, set them up to be, and then Larry Quinn, of course, was involved in both Canalside and the Sabres. And then that set up the Sabres to be purchased and built upon, maybe not in a hockey sense till lately, but in a business sense and in a developmental sense by the Pegulas, who then built the Lecom Harbor Center across the street. And meanwhile, Canalside keeps building up, so does much of the rest of downtown. Delaware North, through sports service, concession business, has played. They've been present and arguably played an important role in this the whole way through. So really, if you look at some of the biggest billionaire names associated with Buffalo, it's interesting how their mark has been left here. And there's not necessarily a lot of connection between those different people, but they've all directly or indirectly played some kind of role. And and that's not me trying to boost up the role of those people, but it's interesting to me when I look at it, because factually it's true. Like they all kind of played a role. So anyway, that's where my brain was going. You said this is freewheeling. You said we're freewheeling.
No, it's all good. But that got me to this.
Yeah.
Arguably, with apologies to Ellicott and Sinatra and Savarino and the big developers in town, you got to think the biggest developer in Buffalo right now is Doug Jamal. Does he? This is just a bizarre, crazy question. Maybe not, but does he have any play in this at all? Is he in the conversation? Does he? Are the big power developers? Are they talking to the like? Are they part of this at all?
I haven't talked to Doug Jamal, so I don't know. So the straight up answer, the responsible and truthful answer from my end is I don't know. My strong suspicion is that Doug Jamal and other developers, you just named a bunch of, people or their companies who have taken an interest or want to have an interest. I think if this happens if there's a stadium downtown, absolutely, you're going to see people wanting to be involved and actively looking at that, right? If it happens in Orchard Park, but there's still that downtown development of some kind that comes along that's somehow packaged with it, then yeah, I could see, because remember too, Pegula Sports has an office downtown and they have the Sabres. And they have the Hardware Center. And this is all one company in the end. It's all Pegula Sports and Entertainment. I could easily see some kind of collaborations happening. I do not know right now what those would be. I'm not sure if anybody does. But you've got to think that there's some brainstorming, there's some talking, there's some chatter.
Yeah.
That's my best day. Yeah, I wish I could give you a better answer.
No, that's fine.
But I don't think people should assume that those things aren't being looked at. Sometimes here, by the way, I feel like I could run for office. I'm giving you both answers. Should I go with what's my gut, OP or downtown? Right. It's a little bit of both. Yeah, I mean, these are people who have made a big impact on Buffalo. Yeah. And, you and I know how big time athletes think and coaches, business people, developers, they are the same. They are competitive. When there's a big game being played, when there's a big event happening, they want to be on the field, and their instinct is to look at it. Doesn't mean they're going to jump in at all costs or at any cost, but they're going to look at it and they're going to think about it and they're going to talk about it. And that may not always be public, but that's the mindset. That's a common mindset you're going to see. So yeah, that's at some level somewhere that's got to be happening. There
will be a lot of news coming on this. Obviously, a lot of bombshells, I'm certain. What for you is, what's the earliest we'll find out what will happen ultimately, in your opinion? Maybe you know what date, but if again, your gut on when the earliest Bills fans will know what's going to happen.
I mean, the earliest, what's being talked about is end of the year, December 31st. You don't typically hear people use the date of December 31st, but they'll say, we want a framework in by the end of the year. Ron Raccuia from Pegula Sports has said that. Mark Poloncarz, the Erie County executive, has spoken of that with some hopefulness or optimism that it could happen. Governor Hochul, to the point I made earlier, essentially is speaking the same language when she says, I want this in the New York State budget, which she proposes in January, which would mean you'd probably want a framework around the end of the year. So if things go on the timeline that the parties inside the room are hoping it does, then they'll know in the next couple of months. We'll know, meaning on the outside, maybe in early 2022. I think that's a possibility. Now, when I say we'll know, that might mean where it's going and roughly what it's going to cost, what's being contributed. And then legislators at multiple levels, Erie County legislators, state legislators, are going to have to be involved. There's a world in which you could see Senator Schumer, Congressman Higgins, but especially Senator Schumer on this being involved if any of the Biden infrastructure money is coming here. There's that level of things. So there's a lot of governmental say in what happens. By the time that all shakes out, we're probably talking spring. Okay. April, May, something like that. That's my best guess. I'll say, ask me in a week, and that could change.
Well, I mean, look it for people that live in Western New York and hate wintertime, you can look forward to the end of winter and the beginning of a new Bills stadium, right? Ideally.
That is ideally. Yeah. And again, if you're a Bills fan who wants if you want a cool place to go watch a game, to hang out with your friends and you want to get rid of any notion that the Buffalo Bills are going to leave. And again, there's no reason to think they are, but if you want to just bury that notion, then from that perspective, that's a pretty good result, right?
Yeah.
If you're someone who wants to see government spend, who doesn't want to see government fund something like this, that's a really fair standpoint too, where you can back it up with a lot of reasons. You're not going to like that result, right? But I think that's what we're looking at.
Okay. So coming maybe a little bit before, look at winter ends, spring starts, we're right around draft time.
Right.
2022, and maybe around the same time we hear some sort of stadium announcement of what's going to happen. Listen, this has been the longest, by the way, you've now set the record for the longest Bull in the Basement ever, Tim O'Shea from the Buffalo News, and we haven't even there's still a lot more to come. Thank you for your reporting. Thank you for your fellow journalists reporting. I know you've mentioned you have a team working on this, and you mentioned their names, and I know you have your whole pandemic lessons thing that we will definitely do. We'll do this. You'll have another guest slot filled for Bull in the Basement when we do pandemic lessons with you. All right.
I'd love to come back, and sadly, I don't think pandemic lessons is going anywhere because COVID's not going anywhere, right? So,
right on.
Yeah, I'll tell you, it's more uplifting to talk about a stadium though than to talk about.
For sure.
In fact, this is the longest. Well, I got to tell you, it's the longest conversation I've had, and it's because I talk a lot. I appreciate your patience. It is the longest conversation I've had without mentioning COVID in a long time too. So
you're welcome.
Happy to have that.
Well, thanks for doing it, man. Again, I really appreciate it. And obviously, for those of you who are listening, please subscribe on YouTube and Spotify, and find it on iTunes and everywhere, and all my social media. You probably know it by now, Facebook and the Twitter and the Gram and all of that. Thank you for watching and listening wherever you're doing it. And Tim, we look forward to having you back on another Bull in the Basement. If I don't talk to you before, have wonderful holidays coming up, man. Thanks for doing this.
You too, man. Thanks so much. Appreciate it.